Hi guys, and welcome to Learning Web Design and Security with FixitGearWare Security. This week's episode makes it the third episode since we started the web development proper training. And the purpose is to ensure that we hit the foundational structures of web designs before we are able to properly move on to demoing live projects that are related to web development. So far, since we started the series, we have shot 2 videos, and those 2 videos are very important and they are quite informative regarding informations you need to know about various types of web servers and other important information when it comes to web development and security. So on this week, we'll be talking about DNS record and its importance. For today's course outline, first we'll be discussing A records and its relationship with DNS. Then after we're done, we'll move on to explain how A records are used on various services. For example, you have the FTP, you have the database, and so on. So you have to know how these A records are associated with these various services to ensure that a website or web that was built functions properly without any errors or security breaches. Then after we're done, we'll be moving on to explaining CNAMEs and autoconfig and its relevance when it comes to DNS records. And for CNAME, as we all know, it's a canonical names and how it is used when it comes to email services. Okay. Then after we're done with CNAMEs, we are going to round up the training by explaining the mail exchange and TXT records and its importance, especially if you're building a website for a big organization. You have to factor in certain services such as email services, right? So you have to understand these various records and how you can secure them in the future when you eventually, build a website for someone or for yourself, and you try to provision the security via proxy firewall services such as Cloudflare or Akamai and so on. So it's very important that you have this foundational knowledge, because without this foundational knowledge, you're like every other person out there claiming to say they do this or they know this, but basically when they are done building website for their clients, these websites on the internet are exposed to various vulnerabilities. So with that being said, let's get started. So for today, let's talk about DNS, which is known as the Domain Name System Records. So basically, when you host your website on a web server, or let's say you require the service of a web hosting company, after providing your name servers, the company will automatically configure the services they have outlined that they provide for that specific, let's say, web hosting services package you purchased. So in web hosting, we all know that they have different tiers of packages, right? So once you have chosen that specific package, it comes with various services, which will be outlined when you are trying to, research on what type of package you should get. So these A records are like a DNS type of record that links those domains or those services to a dedicated IPV4 address. So basically, those IPV4 addresses stands as like a pathway to access that specific services. So for example, let's say my A record says ftp.fixitgearware.com, right? By right, that address will be pointing to an IPv4 address. So whenever I try to access ftp.fixitgearware.com, it's going to be connected to that IP address, or that IP address will be contacted. So this is what we call DNS resolution. Okay. So what IP address is associated with ftp.fixitgearware.com, and of course, open the page. Okay. Of course, in the real sense, we are not using this as our FTP server. For some security reasons, you have to be more enhanced to learn how to configure FTP servers, not to be accessible even on the web, or let's say someone tries to like access it via a client in the terminal, they will not be able to access it. So this is just for an example. Okay. So basically that's how area code works. It can also be for subdomains. Let's say we have www.FixitGearWare.com. So whenever you put that subdomain to access FixitGearWare.com, the area codes will point to the IP address that is associated with that domain name, and of course retrieve the resource which you're trying to access. Now, having spoken about area codes, what are the common area codes association? So for example, we said area codes can be associated with FixitGearWare.com. It can be associated with your mail services. Let's say, for example, the hosting company chooses to provide a mail services for you, right? So that mail services has to be connected to a mail exchange server. So whenever somebody sends an email, or whenever you want to send an email, it's going to be tied to that IP address. Okay. So these are common association of area codes. You can also find area codes associated with database, the secured shell, which is SSH, subdomains, and so on. So basically, when you host your website, under the DNS configuration, on the cPanel part of your web server's login, you should be able to click on DNS, and every of these configurations that are associated with these area codes will be displayed. So, of course, like we said, the domain or the services and the IP address it is pointing to. Now, having spoken about common area codes, let's now talk about CNAME autoconfig. When we talk about CNAME autoconfig, what do you understand by CNAME? So basically, CNAMEs are known as canonical names, and they are associated with email configuration settings. Okay, so these email configuration settings are very important because when you are hosting a website for an organization, you also know that this organization needs what we call an email services. So this email services is like how they connect or they communicate with their various clients or customers or readers or users of their services, right? So you should understand how this is associated with the CNAME, okay? Because when you set up these email services, most of these employees in the client's organization might decide they want to link these configurations to like email applications such as Outlook or let's say iOS, right? So they need a configuration settings. This is where the canonical names comes in. So these canonical names are how you can, auto configure or auto detect the right settings for the user's email account. So once you set it up on Outlook, let's say on the user's iPad or Android, or let's say the Outlook app on their computer, this settings is now going to enable them to receive any email that is coming in from any organizations they are dealing with or anyone that has that their business email into Outlook that is on their personal device, organization device, and of course read these email messages to understand what the contents are. Now, common settings that are associated with CNAMEs and autoconfigs are like IMAP, which is also known as the Internet Message Access Protocol. Like we previously explained, it's used by the email clients to retrieve email messages that has been stored on the email server. Okay, so let's say you have an email coming in, right? This email will come in to your company's or organization's email server and it will be there. So each time you log in, let's say you log in and you try to read an email, IMAP is responsible for retrieving these email messages from the email server and of course presenting them to you. Okay, so the purpose of IMAP is basically to ensure that the emails are constantly on the server and you can access them on your device from anywhere in the world. Okay, so you should read more about the ports. Common ports for IMAP is like you're using 1434 unencrypted. And of course, if you want to implement SSL and TLS, then you have to talk about port 993. Okay, now let's talk about SMTP. So the simple mail transfer protocol is basically to transfer emails, which of course in the logical sense is to send email messages out. So whenever you send an email from your, let's say your Outlook app that has been configured with your organization's email server, SMTP is responsible for sending the emails out whenever you send those emails. Okay. So basically when you write an email and there is no SMTP configured on that device, you cannot be able to send email out. So basically, you're just going to be able to read email addresses whenever they come in because IMAP has been set up. But because the SMTP has not been properly configured, your device is not going to be able to send email out to customers or employees or to like other personnel that you contact with your organization email because SMTP has not been enabled or has not been set up. Okay, so the key purpose of SMTP is basically just to handle outgoing emails whenever you send them. And of course, it's popularly known that SMTP uses port 25, and for other advanced configuration, it uses like port 587, and for TLS and SSL implementation 465. So CNAME and autoconfig has to do with anything that has to do with email configurations on devices and setting them up manually on various third-party applications such as Outlook or iOS app on your organization's device or personal device that you use. Now, lastly, let's talk about srov.autodiscover.tcp. So basically, this supports both hybrid and hosted environments, okay? Now, how do you understand this? It's basically how you can set up your email for, let's say, on a device, or let's say you want to access the email on the web. Like, let's say you want to access via webmail on your browser, right? So srov.autodiscover.tcp is basically what does this. And it runs on port 443 to ensure that it's secure. Now, under autodiscover.tcp, we have the MX record, which is the mail exchange record, and the TXT record. Okay, so when we talk about MX record, what comes to your mind? MX record specifies name servers that receive email messages for the domain. So each time you set up your organization's web hosting services, and let's say the web hosting company provides email services for you as part of the package inclusive when you purchased the subscription for the web hosting company, right? It has information about the name server. Let's say you're using HostGator, right? It can be whatever, HostGator.com, MS1 and so on. So basically this is like the mail exchange server or domain that each time that a message is sent to you, that domain picks it up and forwards it to your inbox. Okay. Now, this is very important that you understand this because, for example, most people use these services, right? I mean, the web hosting services to host their website. Now, let's say they bought these services and they are using this name servers to spam or send malicious payload. After a while, that name server will be blacklisted. Okay. Now, if the name server is blacklisted, it means when people try to look up the MX record or the other records that are very important before they can send email or do business with you, it will be shown that this name server is blacklisted. And this is very dangerous for business because now you're faced with people not trusting your organization. So once in a while, from a cybersecurity perspective right now I'm speaking, you should know how to check out this MX record to see if there has been any reports of blacklisting. You can now contact the web hosting company to look into this. Of course, they know the right organization to contact, and of course, raise the blacklisting reports that has been reported within a period of time because of the excessive usage of these servers erroneously to perform some malicious attempts or spamming activities. So that's the importance of MX. MX basically is a DNS record that enables you to receive email messages from your domain name. Now, lastly, let's talk about TXT record. So when we talk about TXT record, we are talking about, records that are much into security to secure your messages. Okay. So under TXT, we have the SPF, which is also the Senders Policy Framework. We have the DKIM, which is the Domain Keys Identified Mail. And we have the DMAC. So DMAC has to do with domain-based authentication and reporting conformance. Okay. So how do these various configurations in the TXT, help to ensure that your email services are secured or protected? First, let's talk about SPF, which is the Senders Policy Framework. So the purpose of this framework is basically to state a few protocols, or let's say rules, that prevents malicious hackers or spammers from sending emails on your behalf. Okay, so hackers, as we know, can find ways to spoof emails, and this email will look like it's coming from your domain, but the intent is to perform some malicious acts and cause a lot of havoc. But if you have properly defined your SPF, whenever a hacker or malicious person tries to send, let's say a nefarious or a dangerous email to the public or to victims, because the IP address that this email is originating from is not defined in the SPF, which is the Senders Policy Framework, the email would not be allowed to be sent. So the email would not go because that IP address is not specified under the SPF that it should be responsible for sending email messages. Now, let's move on to DKIM. So domain keys identified mails are basically to ensure that the email content has not been tampered with. So if you know more about public keys and private keys mechanisms, this is how DKIM works. So with DKIM, it provides a digital signature, okay, and appends in the header of that messages, which is of course the email messages you're sending, the public key, So once the recipient receives the email will be verified with the public key that is appended to the head of that messages to know if the email has been tampered with. So let's say the email has been tampered with. Of course, the public key signing will be different, right? And it will report to the user who is receiving that email that it's a spam, or this content is coming from an untrusted source, or it has been altered with, or some error messages, to keep the user or the recipient of this email on alert. Okay, so this record, you also have to learn how to configure them on the server side. Let's say you're proxying through a firewall, or let's say you're proxying through a third-party firewall service like Akamai. You should learn how you can configure these records and specify them so that when something malicious happens associated with your domain, the SPF and DKIM would always come to your rescue. Now, lastly, let's talk about DMAC, okay, which is the domain-based message authentication and reporting conformance, right? So it's a rule that incorporates the SPF and DKIM. So how does it work? It's very simple. It tells the receiving server to do some, verifiable checks. So those checks, can be to check if the email has been tampered with, here we're talking about DKIM, or to check if the origin IP is the actual IP that is permitted to send us, email messages. So if these two informations have been verified, which is the SPF and DKIM, and it discovers that they do not meet the security rules or policy that has been defined in these various TXT records. Now, under the DMARC rule, whatever the security administrator has defined in that rule is what will be conducted or what will be carried out. So common DMARC policies or rules are like, okay, reject, quarantine, or allow the email to come into your inbox. Like basically, to be on a safe side, it's always advisable to use the quarantine. Okay, don't reject emails, because sometimes it can be some malfunction from the email server of the sender, or some reasons which we cannot like say specifically we can hold on to. It can be also expired certificate. Okay, and this messages has been sent, and if you put like, let's say, reject, it means the email message might bounce back, and the person might think that, okay, your organization's email services is not true, or they have sent to the wrong email address. So to be on a safe side, the safest rule to specify when using the MAC policy is to quarantine the email. So via quarantine or, sending to spam, you can always go back and filter those emails and check, for important information. It is also good to quarantine emails in the sense that, let's say, hackers every day always come out with new tricks on social engineering, right? So imagine you rejected an email. That means you cannot find information on how to prepare the next phishing training or simulation for your organization, right? But by quarantining these emails, you can always go back to review, get those IP addresses that are always sending these, malicious emails, and, make your own list of, security improvements you need to do. It can either be blacklisting those IP addresses, or using those email messages and IP addresses as security awareness, or even reporting them. But when you reject those emails and they bounce, it might not get to your organization's email server today, but next time there might be a security loophole that might make the email to get into your mail server. And by that, you have, been compromised when you click to the malicious link that has been embedded in that email. Okay. So quarantine is the best policy to always set up whenever you are trying to configure your DMARC policies. Don't send directly to your inbox, and don't reject. Just quarantine them, and from time to time, you review those emails and see what the contents are, and of course, retrieve the necessary information you might want to use, either for your security awareness, or for your security improvement, or even to communicate with the right party if you discover that the email was coming from a legitimate source. So, summary of today's topic, we have been able to talk about the relationship between A records and the domain name systems. We have been able to explain IMAP and SMTP servers and how it works. Then the working concept of SPF, DKIM, and DMARC has been properly explained. And after we have explained all this, you have been able to have a good understanding of what MX and TXT record is all about. In our next episode, we'll be talking about a video on some important things you need to know when you want to build a website. Then after that episode, we will move on to proper once in a while drop-in projects on web development and how you can build various web apps based on the frameworks we have stated on our GitHub repository that we'll be explaining. So these projects, we'll be building them live and showing you how they work. And a few of those releases will be done. Okay, we'll be releasing them in batches for you to understand how it works and what we are doing. So it's very important that you follow this YouTube channel and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our trainings. We are geared up to teach you a lot of things, and we promise you that after you have learned from our trainings, you can be able to confidently tell yourself that you are a web developer stroke web security expert. So with that, we have come to an end of this week's episode and this month's episode. We want to say thank you for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe. Those numbers are very important to us, and share with your friends so they can also learn just the way you're learning. And remember, this knowledge is free. We are not charging you for this, except when our paid or premium courses will be out. And our paid and premium courses will be very, very, very detailed, because we have a lot of things to teach you when it comes to web development and how you can implement security as well. So thanks for watching and have an amazing weekend. Bye for now.